question, what is the social cost of carbon? People are concerned and puzzled about these terms. So carbon tax is a price set by the government per metric ton of emissions to tax the use of hydrocarbons, and those are fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal. Alberta has had a carbon tax ever since 2007, but now a carbon tax will be applied to everyone and everything. Human consumption of manufactured goods and related use of fossil fuels were thought to cause global warming in the 1980s and 90s, but scientists, quite a few of them, dispute this theory today. Some of them did back then, but now there's even more evidence that it's not CO2 that drives climate change. It's a consequence of climate change. The idea of a carbon tax is to reduce emissions because if it's more expensive, then in theory you will drive less, you'll buy less, you'll use less. And the idea of the social cost is that what you are using today is creating a long-term problem in the future. So that's like the social cost of carbon, that we may have more droughts, more floods, all kinds of climatic events. So the social costs of carbon are described as negative events, such as global warming. But history shows that there have been lots of cyclical weather events and climate periods with very extreme weather before fossil fuel use. So no evidence to date supports the claim of more weather or climate extremes in the current warm period. You know, you keep hearing that every day, but if you go online and you look at fact-checking Mark Carney, that's a very good blog piece done by Princeton Energy Advisors. He went point by point through Mark Carney's claims to the Insurance Bureau of last fall, and he found out that none of them are supported by the actual evidence, and the evidence comes from US government websites. It's not a secret. So the benefit of more carbon dioxide is that it's made the planet greener, and it's actually increased crop production. So the key elements of the Alberta Climate Plan are that there's early phase out of coal-fired power plants by 2030, cap on oil sands carbon dioxide emissions at 100 metric tons a year, cut the methane emissions by 45% by 2025, have a carbon tax that begins at $20 per ton of CO2 in 2017, goes up to 30 in 2018, and that also natural gas and gasoline will be taxed. Oddly, biofuels are left out, and they have lots of emissions. And this would subsidize $3.4 billion over 5 years in subsidies to wind and solar. That's money that will come from your pocket. So in a cost-benefit analysis, the objective should be met by the steps engaged. So the government objective is to stop climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide, and we don't think the plan will achieve either objective. Is the climate plan effective? We believe there will be dire consequences. First of all, in our view, the natural influences on climate are far more dominant than carbon dioxide and human effects. We agree that humans have some effect on climate, but let's look at some of the things the sun drives. Cyclical solar patterns, radiation variations, ocean currents, atmospheric oscillations, gravitational impacts, cosmic ray influences on cloud formation, and a dynamic interaction of all these things on Earth and from the outside, and more. So the human influence from industry and consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture, land use, deforestation, and water diversion, and polluting aerosols are more important factors. But we don't think they'll lead to catastrophic anthropogenic warming. For Canada, nominal warming is actually beneficial, because otherwise we'd be back under quite a few miles of ice. And we say that carbon tax price is unnecessary, but if it's required for political reasons in terms of doing business internationally, it's set far too high. We think that phase-out coal is economically destructive to Alberta, and health and climate claims regarding modern coal use are not supported by the evidence. Okay, so is climate change your fault? This is what most environmental groups will tell you, that Santa is going to drown because you're driving your car. But the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It reviews scientific literature on human causation of climate change and issues reports, and governments rely on these reports for making up policy that affects you. So the IPCC itself acknowledges that nature and humans affect climate, and it also acknowledges that climate may be warmer or cooler. And climate change happens not over a couple of years. It happens over decades, centuries, and thousand-year cycles. This is a differentiation between weather, like what we see in Louisiana with the flooding. That's weather. What we see in Alberta, where we used to have 2 miles of ice and now we have the Okotoks Big Rock, that's climate change. So those miles of ice melted. Okay, in the 1950s, global cooling was thought to be imminent, and Betty Friedan there wrote The Coming Ice Age for Harper's Magazine. But by the late 80s and 90s, global warming was being pushed. And by 2012, we already had inconvenient pausing in that warming. By 2013, the IPCC revealed in their report there had been no significant warming trend for 15 years. That's now about 18 and a half years. Now you may say, wait a minute, what about last year? What about that El Nino? What about all that hot weather? Wasn't it the hottest year ever? Well, an El Nino is a natural factor. It's a natural phenomenon. It's an atmospheric oscillation, and there was another one involved, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which someone like Ken can tell you all about. I can't, but I do know that they cause natural spikes in warming, and those go away. So, scientifically observed, the warming values in the past 18 years have been very close to zero. And research has revealed that carbon dioxide has less effect on warming than thought. And Judith Curry is one of the scientists in the United States. She's got about 30 years experience as an atmospheric scientist. And she has written a number of reports on this and testified to the US Senate that carbon dioxide is not the control knob that can fine-tune climate, meaning that if you're taxing carbon, you're not going to do anything for the climate, but you're going to make all your people poor. And you'll notice also claims of consensus are a bandwagoning social proof. We have a report on the 97% consensus, and there isn't one. What there is consensus about, has it warmed since the turn of the century, since 1850? Yes, it has warmed a little bit. So just to give you a quick glimpse, there have been many previous warming and cooling periods. And you can see here that our current warm period is about as warm, if not cooler, than previous warm periods. And in the previous warm period, like the medieval warm period, that was a time when all the castles and the cathedrals were built in Europe. There was abundant food, the weather was pleasant, and about the 1300s, 1315 or so, it started raining. I just read the book, The Third Horseman, and by William Rosen, I believe it is. He writes in there that around 1311, 1315, it rained for 3 years without stopping in Northern Europe and UK. And all the topsoil was washed away. They couldn't put up hay for the animals because there was no sun. They couldn't dry it. There is mass famine. That's climate change. Anyway, that led into the Little Ice Age, where weather became very unpredictable, and so warming doesn't appear to be actually that bad for most of us. It appears to be pretty good for us. And of course, the Little Ice Age was a time of chaos across Europe. Since climate models predicted extreme warming that has not happened, social costs of carbon are also estimated at too high a rate. So you can see here that the top red line is what the models were estimating, and that's the average of 102 IPCC model runs. But you can see along the bottom in the blue squares and the blue dots, those are weather balloons and satellite data, and you can see that they match up pretty well, and it's not that warm. It's not as warm as predicted. The problem is most of the climate models, or most of the economic models that are used to set carbon taxes are calibrated to that upper red line. So why do some people want a carbon tax? A carbon tax is supposed to make hydrocarbons and fossil fuels more expensive, so you'll use less of them. So some people see it as a way of preserving a precious fuel. And a reduction in use is said to reduce carbon dioxide and thus reduce global warming. And we know that's not correct because Dr. Curry just told us that. The tax predicts that using fossil fuels will cause health and climate damage in the future. That's supposedly why we're paying into some kind of a fund to protect ourselves in the future, but so far we don't see these funds being used for that in other places. And the complex economic formulas that are used to calculate what this tax should be can be found in Ken's technical presentation. Let's note that the tax does not incorporate the social benefits of the use of fossil fuels. And that's on two different levels. There's a social benefit of warming, whereby it's easier to work outside, for instance. You can be more productive, you have more productive farmland. You have less heating costs. So these are all kinds of social benefits, but the other social benefit is a direct personal one, and that is each of us has the equivalent of 97 servants, thanks to fossil fuels. We have some very good information from Dr. Ross McKittrick on our website. We have this report, and also we have 14 little 2-minute clips with him, and his complete presentation where he discusses, including math, the pause in global warming climate policy implications. So what are fossil fuel social benefits? CO2 fertilization is one. That means there's a rise in carbon dioxide and it makes more things grow. And that's what NASA recently found out, that we're greening the earth. And probably a good thing. In Canada, the net benefits of CO2 increase are very substantial because we're normally in a very cold country here and a short growing season. So slightly warmer is effective for us and helpful. Globally, the net benefits are likely between $11 and $19 US per ton of CO2, and globally, $490 billion a year to $690 billion a year. So as you can see on the left-hand side, the phase-out coal project was already in process. The federal plan had all these plants being decommissioned one after the other, usually according to their age, because the older plants have fewer emissions management systems and are less efficient overall. So they wanted to get them offline first. So the last 6 or so of the plants are all high quality, modern facilities, very efficient, and the last 2, Genesee 3 and Keep Hills 3, are world-class supercritical plants. At the time that Keep Hills 3 was commissioned, it was the most advanced coal-powered fire plant in North America. So, I mean, if your theory is reuse, recycle, why are you abandoning these excellent facilities? Anyway, and so by the climate plan, after 2030, there will be no more power plants. Because when the carbon tax, this is an unintended consequence that we foresee, especially because the market is very unstable right now for investors. The early phase out of coal is thought to happen by 2030, but what will happen next year when the carbon tax kicks in, many of these old plants will become unprofitable much earlier. And so what will happen? People will shut them down. And in the meantime, no one is building new capacity. So we need about 8 times 800 megawatt natural gas plants to replace the existing coal plants. And nobody's building them. And just so you know, Alberta is powered by coal. You know, it'd be different if we had all kinds of extra natural gas plants floating around, or if we were hooked up to BC Hydro in a big way. We're not. We have a connection there, but it's not very big. But you can see that in 2014, 90% of our power came from coal, 55%, and natural gas. In 2015, 64% of our power was generated by coal. It's the cheapest form of power generation and the most reliable, and we happen to have lots of it in Alberta. That's why we use it. Ontario had no coal, so for them to phase out their coal plants wasn't maybe that smart from our perspective, but you know, they were running about 28% coal, and they had to import it from somewhere or buy it from somewhere. We have lots of it, and we own it because of the provincial arrangement on minerals. So this is Christmas Day 2015. I took a screenshot that day, and just to show you what was lighting up your house and your tree and what cooked your turkey, it was coal and natural gas. And if you do the simple math there, without that coal in the TNG category, if you take the coal out of there, there would not have been enough power for our needs. So this is going to be a critical issue, a very critical issue, and soon, you know, and when it happens, we will be forced into a situation like in the UK where they were having to endure rolling blackouts. So the costs of coal phase-out are also exorbitant, and we also feel they're unnecessary because, as we showed, there was already a sensible plan in place for phasing out coal over time. So 22 billion is the cost that we have gotten from experts. 11 billion to build replacement natural gas plants of equivalent capacity, and that's based on building 8 by 800 megawatt gas plants, and those would be similar to the Shepard plant, the new Shepard plant in Calgary, which cost 1.4 billion. And more than 11 billion to compensate the coal industry, because they built all these very fancy coal-fired power plants. Now they have to just shutter them and throw them away. Well, they want to be paid. That was, you know, they had an agreement with the government. 7,000 coal industry workers will be put out of work. 30 communities will be destroyed. And now the Alberta government is suing itself over $2 billion in power purchase agreements. So, in fact, by doing that, they basically proved their own point that should have been in the contract. They are the proof that that clause needed to be there, which is rather ironic. So other phases, consequences of coal phase-out. The carbon tax will make older plants less profitable long before 2030. If they close earlier due to unprofitability, we may be without sufficient power. This could lead to rolling blackouts. Consumers will have to pay the cost of the carbon tax, as it will be passed on to them by everyone. All the companies will say, oh, you want to buy a hamburger? Well, it costs us more to ship the burgers here, more to get the buns, more to pay the staff, because now they're all at $15 an hour, more to pay for the paper, because the paper is now, you know, that wraps it up. Everything, it will be cumulative. And consumers will also have to pay for the backup power of natural gas plants. And this is because the government's planning on adding a lot of wind and solar, which are intermittent and not very reliable sources of power. So you have to have enough power for the whole system at the ready all the time. And so what happens is you have a natural gas plant running in the background, waiting until the wind dies off. Well, you have to pay that gas plant provider. Somebody has to pay them. At the same time, you're going to be paying subsidies to the wind farm, whether it's when it's producing and when it's not. So power prices will go up. In other jurisdictions that phased out coal and added renewable power, prices went up 3 to 5 times. The cost of making a wind turbine or a solar panel might be less. Now, many advocates say, oh, the cost has really come down. That's true. But the cost of integrating it to the system has not changed, and sometimes it's even more complicated. So, ironically, wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear are also only possible with huge amounts of fossil fuels that are mined and often very rare materials. So just to compare, the Alberta government because the Alberta system is deregulated, the companies took the risk on themselves to develop these new facilities. So if you look at the map, you can see that Alberta carries no electrical utility debt per se. When you look at the other provinces, Ontario's is way over 44 billion now. This is from 2014. So it's way up there. Quebec Hydro, 53 billion. Even Newfoundland, Labrador, 7 billion. Sask Power, 6 billion. BC Hydro, 20 billion. These are huge amounts of money. And yet we have private industry running our power system for us, and the investors invested in it. The Alberta Government Climate Plan says our air is about to get cleaner. In effect, that is true. Like if you stop some pollution, you do somewhat clean up the air. But if you look at the chart on the side there, you can see that coal is actually a nominal emitter of PM 2.5. That's fine particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less. So you can see that if you compare it to residential fireplaces put out double. If you compare it to agriculture and road dust, it's many times more. And at the bottom you can see that actually forest fires, wildfires, put out 1,000 times the PM 2.5. That's in 2011. I'm sure this year it was way more. But you know, Mother Nature is very good at dumping stuff in the environment. So part of also what we see is that hospitals rely on affordable power. Every month hospitals use a fortune in power, and that's why we can have all these modern medical miracles like heart transplants and CAT scans and cancer treatments and you name it. But once you start to raise the price of power, then the hospital system has to say, okay, do we cut staff or do we cut services? Because they also have a budget. And we're already at about 45% of the government budget in Alberta for health services. So raising power by phasing out coal won't be helping the system whatsoever. And adding wind and solar won't help reliable generation. Wind and solar are very whimsical, and you can see that in Ontario, irrational energy planning has tripled the power rates. So just some of the ideas here: wind costs about $1 million a megawatt to integrate to the grid. And a transmission line from Calgary to Pincher Creek costs $2.2 billion, but we only get about 4% of our power generation from that wind. Almost $1 billion a year to subsidize wind and solar. And for that you don't get much power. You can build another gas plant for that. So how do we know the costs go up? Well, we looked at the evidence. So if you look price shock, the electric prices paid by industry in Germany, they're way high. China, it's flat. France, it's up and going up. US, it's flat. If you look in the middle, you see that this is from a very good report called Lessons Learned about the German experience, and you'll see that the countries with the most wind and solar have the highest power prices. And you can see also from 2005, when the EU introduced its climate plan, which is fairly similar to many elements of ours, you can see that that power prices rose 37%. And higher power prices lead to energy poverty. So it crushes business. In Alberta, 75% of the power is used by industry. Industry creates jobs. So if the prices go up, the companies either move or lay off staff or ask for a subsidy. That's what's happened a lot in Germany. Industry went and said, you know what, we're going to leave Germany unless you do something about the power price. So the government said, okay, we'll give you a subsidy. But who does that come from? It comes from taxpayers. And the carbon tax. After all these costs and turning our power grid upside down, what will we be achieving to stop global warming that already stopped and stop climate change that seems to have stopped naturally? We will be changing the global temperature reduction perhaps by 0.00007 degrees Celsius, which is insignificant and undetectable. So we're hoping that people will speak up, share this information with your family and friends. If you want another presentation, let us know.